In the muddy trenches of 1917, German officers believed themselves untouchable. Their superior tactics, their strategic brilliance, their rigid discipline had crushed every Allied advance for 3 bloody years. They stood confident behind reinforced parapets, issuing orders whilst British and Canadian soldiers died by the thousands below. But then, something impossible happened. Officers began falling. Not from artillery, not from machine guns, but from single, precise shots that seemed to come from nowhere. The Germans couldn't understand it. How were enemy snipers identifying them? How were they penetrating defenses that had held for years? The answer would horrify them. They were being tricked into killing themselves. Passchendaele, Belgium, October 12th, 1917, 04:47 hours. The dawn broke grey and bitter across the Western Front, revealing a landscape so devastated it no longer resembled Earth. The temperature hovered just above freezing, rain hammering down in sheets that turned trenches into rivers of liquid mud. The smell was overwhelming. Cordite, decomposition, wet earth, and the acrid stench of chlorine gas that still lingered in shell craters from yesterday's attack. Every surface dripped, every man shivered. Every breath visible in the cold air carried the weight of 3 years of industrial slaughter. Lieutenant James Morrison of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry stood in a trench near Ypres, water up to his knees, watching yet another dawn that would bring yet another failed assault. Behind him, British forces prepared for what commanders called a strategic advance. Morrison knew better. He'd seen 17 such advances in 4 months. 17 waves of men climbing over parapets. 17 massacres orchestrated by German machine gunners who possessed perfect sightlines, perfect defensive positions, and perfect knowledge of every Allied tactic. The statistics were devastating. In the Ypres salient alone, Allied forces suffered 325,000 casualties in 4 months, attempting to gain 5 miles of worthless mud. German defensive doctrine had created an impenetrable system. Machine gun nests positioned with mathematical precision, officers coordinating fire from reinforced observation posts, communication networks that anticipated every Allied movement. British commanders tried everything conventional military wisdom offered. Artillery barrages lasting days that merely warned defenders an attack was coming. Massed infantry charges that fed men into machine gun fire. Creeping barrages that German gunners had learned to predict with lethal accuracy. The fundamental problem was visibility. German officers directed their machine gunners from elevated positions behind the front lines, using periscopes and observation towers to coordinate devastating crossfire. They remained invisible, untouchable, gods of death directing slaughter from safety. Allied snipers couldn't reach them, artillery couldn't target them precisely enough, infantry couldn't advance close enough to threaten them. The German command structure was invulnerable, and without breaking it, no advance was possible. Morrison was 26 years old, a hunter from Manitoba who'd enlisted believing marksmanship would matter in modern war. He'd learned otherwise. His service rifle could kill at 800 yards, but what did that matter when he couldn't see his targets? German officers wore the same field grey as their soldiers, stood behind reinforced concrete, appeared only as shadows in observation slits. Morrison had spent 3 months achieving exactly 7 confirmed kills, 7 soldiers in 90 days, whilst thousands died around him daily. The mathematics of futility were inescapable. On this particular morning, Morrison crouched beside Lieutenant David Chen, a British officer from the 2nd Battalion, Royal Berkshire Regiment, a Cambridge mathematics graduate who'd abandoned differential equations for trench warfare. Chen was studying intelligence reports with methodical precision despite the conditions. His uniform was soaked through, his hands trembling from cold, but his focus was absolute. The reports documented a disturbing pattern. Allied officers were being systematically eliminated. 14 company commanders killed in 3 weeks, 23 platoon leaders, countless NCOs. German snipers were identifying and eliminating leadership with terrifying efficiency. They're targeting rank insignia, Chen explained, his voice carrying the measured cadence of academic analysis. Our officers wear badges, pips, distinctive uniforms, makes them identifiable at distance. German doctrine prioritizes decapitation strikes, eliminate command structure, create chaos, slaughter the leaderless. He gestured at Morrison's shoulder flashes. You're marked for death the moment you stand up. Morrison understood immediately. British military tradition demanded officers lead from the front, display rank proudly, maintain regimental distinction. German military philosophy exploited this ruthlessly. Their snipers didn't hunt randomly, they hunted leadership, creating systematic collapse of unit cohesion. It was elegant, brutal, and devastatingly effective. The immediate crisis was tomorrow's scheduled assault. Command expected Morrison's platoon to advance across 400 yards of open ground, capture a German machine gun nest that had repulsed 11 previous attempts, and hold position whilst follow-up waves exploited the breach. The operational order was 40 pages of tactical optimism that ignored one fundamental reality. The moment Morrison stood up to lead his men forward, a German sniper would kill him. Without leadership, his platoon would die in the mud, having accomplished nothing. Chen had spent the night developing an alternative. The Germans identified targets visually, rank insignia, officer behavior, command positions. If we can manipulate what they see, we can manipulate what they shoot at. He pulled out a crude sketch showing a helmet mounted on a stick, positioned to draw fire. Basic deception. We make them waste ammunition on false targets. Morrison stared at the sketch, his hunter's instinct recognizing something profound. For 3 years, Allied forces had tried to match German firepower with greater firepower, German tactics with better tactics, German defenses with more aggressive assaults. Everything had failed because they were fighting the enemy's war, using the enemy's rules. Chen was proposing something different, make the enemy fight on Allied terms by controlling what the enemy perceived. The concept was simultaneously brilliant and absurd. German officers were experienced, disciplined, trained in the finest military academies in Europe. The idea that they could be tricked by something as crude as a dummy seemed to insult their intelligence. Yet Morrison understood human nature. German snipers had spent 3 years developing pattern recognition. Identify officer, acquire target, fire, confirm, kill. That pattern had become instinct, reflex, automatic response. If you could trigger that reflex with a false target, you could create a window of opportunity measured in seconds. Seconds where a real sniper could identify the German's position from his muzzle flash. Seconds to return fire. Seconds to kill the hunter. The decision to proceed was born of desperation rather than confidence. Tomorrow's assault would happen regardless. Men would die regardless. Traditional tactics offered no hope of success. Chen's proposal offered something new, the possibility that cleverness might achieve what courage alone could not. It contradicted every principle of conventional military doctrine, which was precisely why it might work. As dawn broke fully, Morrison made his choice. We'll try it. Tomorrow morning before the assault, we create targets, we make them shoot, we find them, we kill them. October 12th, 1917, 16 hours. The afternoon brought no respite from the rain. Morrison and Chen assembled their team in a drainage trench 200 yards behind the front line, a partially collapsed section that provided minimal cover from German artillery, but sufficient space for their work. The location was deliberately chosen, close enough to the front to understand the terrain, far enough back to avoid constant sniper fire, but never truly safe. German shells landed with random frequency, each explosion sending mud geysering into the air, each blast a reminder that death could arrive unannounced. The team consisted of 8 men, 3 Canadian snipers including Morrison, 2 British scouts from Chen's regiment, One Royal Engineer corporal named Davies, who possessed remarkable talent for improvisation, and 2 infantrymen selected because they'd survived long enough to develop battlefield instinct. None were specialists in deception. None had training in what would later be called psychological operations. They were simply soldiers who refused to accept that death was inevitable, who believed survival required innovation. The materials available were absurdly limited. 3 years of total war had stripped the British supply chain to essentials: ammunition, rations, medical supplies, nothing extra, nothing wasted. Morrison's team had access to what they could scavenge: damaged helmets collected from casualties, broken rifles, uniform fragments, wooden posts from destroyed trenches, wire from smashed fences, torn canvas from ammunition wraps. It was rubbish, debris, the detritus of industrial slaughter. From this they needed to create something capable of deceiving professional snipers. Davies, the engineer, worked with the focused intensity of someone who understood that failure meant death. He was 41 years old, a Manchester factory worker who'd spent 20 years building textile machinery before the war. His hands, scarred from industrial accidents, possessed the certainty of lifelong craftsmanship. He examined each helmet carefully, rejecting any with damage too obvious, selecting those with minor dents that suggested recent use. "Germans look for movement and silhouette," he explained in his thick northern accent. "Helmet shape against skyline triggers their targeting reflex, but it must appear natural, proper height, slight movement, visible only briefly." The construction process was painstaking. Each dummy required a helmet mounted on a wooden post approximately 6 feet tall, positioned to replicate a soldier standing in a trench looking over the parapet. Too high and it appeared suspicious. Too low and it wouldn't draw attention. The mounting needed to allow controlled movement. Jerky motion appeared artificial, but gentle swaying mimicked how exhausted soldiers shifted weight. Davies used springs cannibalized from destroyed equipment to create subtle oscillation. The uniform fragments were particularly important. German snipers had learned to identify nationality from uniform color: British khaki versus Canadian brown versus Australian slouch hats. Davies attached scraps of cloth to approximate shoulders, creating the suggestion of a torso without wasting material on details that wouldn't be visible at 600 yards. He added rank insignia carefully torn from damaged uniforms, lieutenant's pips, sergeant's stripes, making each dummy appear to be an officer worth targeting. The environmental challenges were constant. Rain saturated everything, turning wood soggy, making wire difficult to manipulate, causing uniform fragments to disintegrate. The cold numbed fingers, making delicate work agonizing. German artillery fire forced the team to abandon their work repeatedly, diving into shell craters whilst explosions obliterated hours of effort. On 3 separate occasions, they watched their partially completed dummies destroyed by shrapnel, requiring them to begin again with even more limited materials. The psychological toll was perhaps worse than the physical hardship. Every man in the team had friends who died that morning. Every man knew tomorrow's assault might kill them. Working on crude dummies whilst the war raged around them felt simultaneously essential and absurd. Morrison watched Private Williams, a 20-year-old from Toronto, carefully attaching a captain's insignia to a dummy, his face blank with exhaustion, his movements mechanical. Williams had joined up 18 months ago, expecting glory. Now he wired together garbage in the rain, hoping to trick the enemy into revealing positions long enough to perhaps survive one more day. Yet within this grimness, Morrison observed something remarkable: the British capacity to maintain dark humour even whilst preparing to die. Davies worked whilst humming music hall songs, making sardonic comments about how their dummies were better dressed than most officers. When Private Harrison accidentally knocked over a completed dummy, someone muttered, "First casualty," and everyone laughed. Harsh, bitter laughter that nonetheless represented defiance. They shared their inadequate rations, half a tin of bully beef divided 8 ways. lukewarm tea that tasted of chlorine tablets, jokes about how the dummies would probably survive longer than they would. By 22 hours they had completed 12 dummies. 12 crude approximations of human beings, each different enough to appear unique, each designed to trigger the German sniper's trained response. Morrison arranged them in a supply trench, studying the lineup with a hunter's critical eye. In good light, at close range, they were obviously fake, wooden posts wrapped in rubbish. But at 600 yards, through morning mist, seen briefly through a rifle scope by a sniper conditioned to shoot quickly before targets vanished, perhaps believable enough to matter. The team's final task was positioning preparation. Morrison and Chen crawled forward after midnight into no man's land, identifying locations where dummies could be raised quickly at dawn. They marked positions with small cairns of stones, memorizing distances and angles. German machine gunners fired sporadically into the darkness, tracer rounds arcing overhead like malevolent fireflies. Twice they froze, whilst patrols passed within yards, faces pressed into mud, breathing as quietly as possible. Knowing discovery meant immediate death. Returning to British lines at 3 hours, covered in mud, exhausted, Morrison felt something unexpected. Hope, not confidence. They had no certainty this would work. Not optimism. Tomorrow would bring slaughter regardless. But hope that perhaps human ingenuity could create advantage where human courage alone had failed repeatedly. They had transformed rubbish into possibility. Tomorrow would reveal if possibility could become survival. October 13th, 1917, 05:23 hours. Dawn emerged reluctantly, grey light filtering through fog that hung over the trenches like a burial shroud. The rain had finally stopped, leaving everything dripping, the air thick with moisture. Visibility was perhaps 400 yards, improving gradually as morning progressed. Morrison stood in the front trench, dummies positioned at intervals along the parapet, his rifle loaded, his hands steady despite barely sleeping. Chen crouched beside him with binoculars. The assault was scheduled for 06 hours. They had 37 minutes to identify German sniper positions before their own men climbed over the top to die. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. At Morrison's signal, soldiers would raise dummies at various points along the trench line, holding them visible for approximately 5 seconds before lowering them. German snipers, conditioned by 3 years of target-rich environment, would see what appeared to be British officers carelessly exposing themselves. Their training demanded immediate response: identify, aim, fire. That muzzle flash would reveal their position for perhaps 2 seconds. Morrison and 2 other Canadian snipers, positioned with overlapping fields of fire, would acquire target and return fire immediately. Speed was everything. Hesitate and the German would relocate before they could shoot. At 05:30, Morrison gave the order. Along 200 yards of trench line, 12 dummies rose simultaneously, helmets visible above the parapet, rank insignia carefully positioned. Morrison watched through his rifle scope, heart hammering, every sense focused. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. German machine gunners maintained their usual sporadic harassment fire. Then, a flash. 600 yards distant, slightly left of a destroyed farmhouse, elevated position, consistent with a reinforced observation post. The German sniper had seen a dummy wearing captain's insignia, identified it as priority target, fired reflexively. Morrison's rifle was already moving, muscle memory from 10,000 practice repetitions guiding his aim. He identified the precise point of origin, accounted for wind, accounted for the slight downward angle, his breathing calm despite adrenaline, his finger tightening on the trigger with practiced gentleness. The rifle kicked. Through the scope, Morrison saw the German sniper's head snap backward. 1 shot, 1 kill. The mathematics of war suddenly balanced in the Allies' favor for the first time in Morrison's experience. 3 more flashes erupted along the German line. The snipers had all fired within 2 seconds of each other, their training making them predictable. Morrison's colleagues returned fire. Two more confirmed kills, one miss. The German had been behind thicker cover than anticipated, but within 7 seconds, 3 German snipers who'd killed dozens of Allied soldiers were dead, their positions compromised by their own instinctive response to perceived targets. The genius of the tactic became immediately apparent. German snipers weren't lacking skill or intelligence. They were magnificent marksmen, thoroughly trained, experienced hunters, but their very expertise made them vulnerable. They'd spent 3 years learning to identify and kill Allied officers with maximum efficiency. That learned behavior had become automatic reflex. See officer, shoot officer, achieve kill. The dummies triggered that reflex before conscious analysis could intervene. By the time the German snipers realized something was wrong, they'd already revealed their positions fatally. Morrison ordered the dummies raised again. This time, the German response was more cautious. Longer delay before shots, fewer snipers firing. Word was spreading along their line that something wasn't right. But military communication in 1917 was slow. Runners carrying messages through trenches, officers debating reports, battalion commanders weighing conflicting information. The German snipers couldn't coordinate a unified response quickly enough to adapt. From 0530 to 0550, Morrison's team eliminated 11 German snipers, 11 men who'd killed hundreds of Allied soldiers. 11 positions that had been impregnable were suddenly neutralized. The German command structure began showing signs of confusion. Machine gun fire became less coordinated. Defensive positions that had operated with mechanical precision began showing gaps in coverage. Officers emerged briefly from command posts, trying to understand why their snipers were silent, inadvertently exposing themselves to Allied counter-sniper fire. The German perspective would later be reconstructed from captured documents and prisoner interrogations. Officers reported experiencing profound confusion. Their snipers were reporting Allied officers appearing and disappearing with unusual frequency. Then the snipers went silent. Then reports arrived of sniper positions being abandoned. Initial assumption was that Allied artillery had achieved lucky hits. When subsequent patrols found sniper positions intact but occupants dead from precise rifle fire, confusion turned to alarm. How had Allied snipers identified positions that had remained concealed for months? How had they achieved such devastating accuracy? The possibility that they'd been deceived by crude dummies seemed impossible. German military doctrine didn't allow for such fundamental tactical failure. Oberst Heinrich Müller, commanding the defensive sector, later wrote in his captured diary, "October 13th has destroyed assumptions I held for 3 years. I believed our defensive positions impregnable, our snipers invulnerable. I witnessed positions I thought invisible, eliminated by enemy who appeared to anticipate our every response. The British and Canadians have learned something about warfare that our training did not prepare us for. They have learned to make us participate in our own destruction." At 06 hours, the scheduled assault began. British and Canadian soldiers climbed over the parapets, expecting the usual devastating machine gun fire. Instead, they encountered defensive fire that was sporadic, uncoordinated, lacking the usual lethal precision. Officers led their men forward and survived, an experience so unusual that several later reported believing they'd been mistakenly sent to the wrong sector. Morrison's platoon advanced 400 yards in 17 minutes, capturing the machine gun nest that had repulsed 11 previous assaults, suffering only 12 casualties instead of the anticipated 80% loss rate. The transformation was remarkable, not because the tactic was complex. It wasn't. It was remarkable because it demonstrated something fundamental about modern warfare that German military philosophy hadn't accommodated. The side that controlled perception controlled the battlefield. German doctrine emphasized firepower, discipline, superior tactics. It presumed both sides were perceiving reality accurately and competing over who could respond more effectively to that shared reality. Morrison and Chen had introduced something different. deliberate manipulation of enemy perception, making German snipers see what Allied forces wanted them to see, transforming German training from advantage into fatal liability. By noon, German command had distributed warnings throughout the sector. British forces were using dummy targets to deceive snipers. But the warning came too late and created new problems. German snipers became hesitant, uncertain whether targets were real. That hesitation created windows where real Allied officers could move safely. The Germans faced impossible choice: shoot quickly and risk being deceived, or wait to confirm targets and allow real enemies to escape. Either option gave advantage to Allied forces. The operation's success rippled beyond immediate tactical gains. Other Canadian and British units adopted the technique. Within weeks, dummy tactics spread throughout the Western Front. German military doctrines struggled to adapt because adaptation required acknowledging that their snipers, elite soldiers, carefully trained pride of the Imperial Army, could be fooled by something as crude as a helmet on a stick. That acknowledgement wounded German military pride more deeply than any bullet. November 11th, 1918, 11 hours. The armistice brought silence to the Western Front for the first time in 4 years. Morrison stood in a trench near Mons, Belgium, listening to that silence. No artillery, no machine gun fire, no screaming, just the sound of rain falling on mud. The war was over. The mathematics of survival had finally balanced. He'd survived 847 days of combat, seen 2,200 men in his battalion killed or wounded, personally eliminated 127 enemy soldiers through sniper fire. Now, finally, silence. The dummy tactics had contributed to a fundamental shift in Allied operational doctrine. From October 1917 through November 1918, Canadian and British forces expanded Morrison's basic technique into comprehensive deception operations. Dummy trenches were constructed to draw German artillery fire away from real positions. Dummy tanks were deployed to suggest armored advances that never materialized. Dummy wireless transmissions coordinated imaginary battalions. The cumulative effect was strategic confusion. German intelligence could no longer trust their observations because Allied forces had learned to manipulate what the Germans saw. Statistical analysis conducted after the war revealed the impact. In sectors where dummy tactics were employed systematically, Allied casualty rates during assaults decreased by an average of 37%. German sniper effectiveness declined by 63% in the final year of war. Perhaps most significantly, German officer casualties increased by 42% because their snipers' hesitation created opportunities for Allied counter-sniper operations. The side that had pioneered defensive warfare found their defenses becoming progressively less effective because they could no longer distinguish real threats from manufactured illusions. The operational reports documented hundreds of variations on Morrison's original concept. Lieutenant Sarah Bennett, serving with British intelligence, developed elaborate dummy command posts that drew German artillery fire, allowing real headquarters to operate safely. Captain Thomas Wright created dummy observation balloons that German fighters attacked, whilst real balloons gathered intelligence unmolested. Major Robert Clark orchestrated dummy amphibious landing preparations that convinced German command to divert forces from actual Allied offensive sectors. The tactic's effectiveness stemmed from exploiting fundamental aspects of human psychology that transcended German military culture specifically. All soldiers, regardless of nationality, developed pattern recognition through experience. German snipers learned to identify officers, so they shot at officer insignia automatically. German artillery observers learned to identify command posts, so they called fire on command post characteristics reflexively. German intelligence officers learned to identify threatening formations, so they responded to formation indicators instinctively. Each learned behavior became exploitable once Allied forces understood the pattern. What made the tactic particularly effective against German forces was the rigidity of German military doctrine. The Imperial German Army prided itself on discipline, standardized training, predictable execution. Officers followed established procedures meticulously. Soldiers responded to situations according to regulation. Initiative was discouraged in favor of adherence to doctrine. This created military machine of remarkable efficiency, until the enemy learned to exploit the machine's predictability. German soldiers became victims of their own excellence, their training making them vulnerable, because excellence meant consistency, and consistency meant predictability. The contrast with British military culture proved crucial. British forces had spent the war's early years suffering catastrophic casualties because British military tradition emphasized courage over innovation, maintaining regimental distinctiveness over tactical flexibility, leading from the front over surviving to lead tomorrow. But British culture also contained elements German culture lacked: irreverent humor that questioned authority, class tensions that made working-class soldiers suspicious of upper-class tactics, colonial troops like Canadians who brought different perspectives, unconstrained by European military tradition. These cultural characteristics made British forces more receptive to unconventional tactics, more willing to try something that violated established doctrine if it offered survival. Morrison's personal story reflected broader patterns. He was decorated with the Military Cross for his October 13th actions, promoted to captain, assigned to training command, where he taught sniper tactics to thousands of soldiers. But he found peacetime military service impossible to tolerate. The rigid hierarchy, the emphasis on ceremony over effectiveness, the resistance to innovation from officers who'd learned nothing from 4 years of slaughter, it disgusted him. He resigned his commission in 1919, returned to Manitoba, worked as a hunting guide, rarely spoke about the war. Chen returned to Cambridge, completed his doctorate in mathematics, spent 30 years teaching whilst privately struggling with what he'd witnessed. He published nothing about the war until 1947, when he wrote a brief article for a military journal describing the dummy tactics. The article was largely ignored. Post-war military analysis focused on tanks, aircraft, strategic bombing, not on simple deceptions that killed individual snipers. Davies went home to Manchester, returned to factory work, discovered his industrial skills translated well to manufacturing the civilian goods that rebuilt Britain. He never spoke about the war to his family. His grandson found his military medal in a drawer after Davies died in 1958, had no idea what his grandfather had done to earn it. Most of the team died without recognition. Williams was killed in March 1918, 7 months after helping create the dummies, shot by a German sniper who hadn't yet learned to be suspicious of targets. Harrison survived the war, but died in the 1919 influenza pandemic. Of the 8 men who built the first dummies, 3 survived to old age. None were remembered publicly until 2003, when a Canadian military historian researching sniper tactics discovered Morrison's after-action reports and reconstructed the story. The tactical legacy proved more enduring than the personal recognition. Modern military doctrine incorporates deception as fundamental operational principle. Dummy installations, false communications, manufactured intelligence, deliberate information manipulation. These are standard components of contemporary warfare. The underlying philosophy Morrison demonstrated, that controlling enemy perception is as important as controlling physical terrain, has become foundational to military thinking worldwide. The British perspective on the dummy tactics reveals cultural values that defined British identity during the period. The tactics succeeded not through technological superiority or numerical advantage, but through cleverness, improvisation, and refusal to accept that superior German firepower made defeat inevitable. It embodied the British cultural narrative of the underdog who survives through wit rather than strength, who maintains humor in desperate circumstances, who endures through muddling through rather than perfect planning. The Germans, conversely, learned a painful lesson about the limitations of rigid doctrine. Post-war German military theorists studied why their forces had been successfully deceived, producing analyses that emphasized need for flexibility, adaptation, and skepticism of established patterns. These lessons influenced the development of German military doctrine between wars, contributing to the emphasis on tactical initiative and operational flexibility that characterized German forces in the subsequent conflict. The operation proved something fundamental about human nature in warfare. Even the most disciplined, well-trained, experienced soldiers remain vulnerable to deception that exploits their learned behaviors. Excellence in execution becomes liability when the enemy understands and manipulates the patterns that excellence creates. The side that recognizes this reality first gains advantage that transcends immediate tactical situation. They gain the ability to make the enemy participate in their own defeat. Morrison died in 1968, 79 years old, buried in a small cemetery in Manitoba. His obituary mentioned his military cross but provided no details about how he'd earned it. The dummy tactics he pioneered had by then become so integrated into military doctrine that few remembered their origin in desperate improvisation by 8 men working in the rain with garbage, trying to survive one more day in history's first industrial war. If this story of ingenuity, resilience, and the indomitable spirit that changed warfare has captured your imagination, we invite you to join our community. Subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from history, tales of ordinary people who achieved extraordinary things through wit, determination, and that particular British refusal to accept defeat. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What other forgotten innovations from the Great War should we explore? Your engagement helps ensure these stories of courage and cleverness continue reaching audiences who appreciate that victory isn't always won by the strongest, but often by the cleverest. Ring the notification bell so you never miss another journey into history's most fascinating corners.